All right. Good Friday morning, everyone. Welcome to the Urban Ecology Center's Backyard Naturalist series. My name is Tim, and welcome to the coldest average temperature day in Milwaukee, at least, January 29th, which means for those of you who despise this time of year, and I'm not one of them, the temperatures from here on out, on average, are going to get warmer. I hope you enjoyed the 2 weeks since we last met, and hopefully you had a healthy and reflective Martin Luther King Day and Inauguration Day. A special thanks, as always, to our Backyard Naturalist subscribers for their extra support of the series. Last weekend, I listened to a great article from the New York Times about clouds, written by John Mollum, called The Amateur Cloud Society, that sort of rattled the scientific community. And I loved it so much that I realized that, well, first of all, I have to do a future episode on clouds because they are an important part of our backyards from both a functional standpoint and an aesthetic one. And as the author introduces this particular story on clouds, he says, what the story is really about is our need to find beauty and awe and delight in the world and the way we come together in the process. And to me, that's why I love hanging out with you all on Friday mornings, because I think we all share that need to find beauty and awe and delight, not only in the world, but in our backyards, the spaces we often hold most dear, and it brings us together on a roughly weekly basis. In this episode of The Backyard Naturalist, we're looking at an animal that is often portrayed as a misfit and a scoundrel, but also one that transcends beauty, intelligence, and spirituality, the American crow. And you can see we didn't have to do any of that high-tech manipulation of this cover shot, since the good folks at Dimension Films already did that when they made the movie The Crow back in the 90s. But first, a quick shout out to the Backyard Naturalist's parent site, the UEC In My Backyard. The entire Urban Ecology Center shut down last week to provide staff a paid week off for us to focus on our own personal wellness during this time. And that included the UEC In My Backyard, but hopefully some of you got to look at the hundreds of archive delights. And they did squeeze in what I think is my second favorite episode of Chad the Nature Dad. And Chad and Kendall are out discussing holes in trees and how important they are for food and shelter for many animals. And it made me realize that cell phones are great investigative tools for finding out what's in some of these tree holes that might be too small to stick your head in. As long as you don't drop your phone inside the tree, which would almost certainly happen to me, so I probably won't do it. Also, I encourage you to listen to the Urban Ecology podcast with new episodes coming out about every other week. The next episode looks at some of the shifts that UEC made during the pandemic, which brought both limitations and hardships, but also new opportunities. And I'd also like to let you all know that the Urban Eco Poets, a group that normally meets monthly at the center, but has since moved temporarily to virtual, has a prompt out this month from Mary to write a nature-based haiku of sorts based on your zip code. So if you live in the zip code 53211, the first line of your poem would have 5 syllables, the second 3, the third 2, and so on. And if some of the folks from this group contributed, that would bring some extra zip code diversity, since we have Colorado and New York and Massachusetts and Illinois and different parts of Wisconsin. So that would be a fun collection. I'd also like to quickly bring your attention to a few more resources from our colleagues. The Association of Nature Center Administrators hosts an online virtual program exchange. So if you get onto their website, you can find other virtual programs run by nature centers across the country. Because as we can see here, even today among our viewers, physical distance doesn't necessarily mean we can't all get together to learn with each other. Also, as I mentioned, the series focuses on the green spaces near to where we stay, our backyards, our porch patios, our local parks. And here in the Milwaukee area, we are on traditional Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Potawatomi homeland. And where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present today. And I encourage us all to gain a better understanding of the indigenous history of our backyards, that sacred land. And one place to start is to download the Native Land app on your phone, which is, of course, just a starting point. But the best source of information would be to contact the nations themselves. I'm also super excited to announce that in 2 weeks, on February 12th, the good folks with the Raptor program at Schlitz Audubon will be our guests during this Backyard Naturalist time slot, and they're going to bring along some live owl ambassadors for a program entitled Owls Designed for Darkness. So we're really excited for that. And you can visit the Schlitz Audubon website for more information on the Raptor program and their Nature from Home website, which is kind of a cousin to the UEC in my backyard. And speaking of cousin sites, while researching next week's episode, Snow Fleas on Cedar, I found a delightful collection of videos from the Beaver Creek Reserve website, our good friends up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, including a winter walk series that had a great short video on snow fleas. So lots of great information out on the interwebs, and I'll try to do my part to help sort out the good ones that I find. Okay, the American crow. There's no trailer today, which is good because trying to tell the story of the American crow in about a half hour is a nearly impossible task. So once again, I'm going to skip some of that mainstream information about the crow, like their physical description, the habitat, food, that kind of thing, and focus on some of the more bizarre and wonderful stories. But there are plenty of great websites and books where you can find a general description of the crow, including the Cornell Lab of Ornithology's website. And there's several books out there on the natural history of crows and ravens. One of my all-time favorite authors, Bernd Heinrich, has some must-read books, particularly on his work with ravens. For today's episode, I drew my information from a wide variety of sources, but I'll give a special shout out to the Great Ologies podcast with Allie Ward and her interview with Dr. Kaylee Swift, as well as the folks over at Mental Floss and the book Crow Planet by Lynn Haupt, who also wrote the book Mozart Starling. That was the basis for the Starling Wars episode early in season 1. And also Kevin McGowan at Cornell University has a frequently asked questions about crows page that was fun to browse. So if you're ever thinking of random questions like, do crows taste good? And what's behind the phrase eat crow? Spoiler alert, it's complicated. But my favorite part about discussing these creatures with you all every week is the personal stories. And in the preface of the second edition of Crow Nation, Haupt mentions that since the first edition, she started to notice that crow tattoos were way more common than she imagined. And she would poll her audiences and talk to tattoo artists. And it looks to her, at least, that this really is a pattern, that crow tattoos are quite popular. And when she talked to people about why crow tattoos, it really started to illuminate that relationship between crows and people that's been around for a long time, and in just about every culture from around the world where people and crows and ravens cohabitated. In her own words, the answers people tell her about why crows is a version of, I've always felt strangely connected to crows, and it almost always involves a matter of spirit, an impulse that lies beyond science, language, the basics of urban ecology, traditional mythology, or even the fact that crows are just really cool birds. The awareness of the crow effect, as she calls it, is as palpable to those of us who have not inked them forever upon our forearms. Crows bring the wild earth to our doorstep, and with their presence invite us beyond the parameters of our everyday human lives and into communion with that wildness. Now more than ever, we are ready to respond. One of my all-time favorite crow experiences happened to me about 20 years ago. I had just taught a ballroom dance class at Marquette University, and I was walking through campus to my car. It was fairly late and dark outside, and as I was walking, my senses started to perk. The flora in my gut were signaling to me, hey, something is out of place, but I didn't know what it was, and I kept walking, and then I heard it. It was just a flap of wings from above, and so my brain said, okay, it's a bird in a tree. And I took a few steps more, and I heard another flap of wings, and then another. And when I looked up, I realized I was surrounded by well over 150 crows just in the 3 trees surrounding me, and they had been completely silent. I could have easily finished the walk to my car without ever knowing I was surrounded. And for the reasons only the crows know, the crows decided to roost in that part of the campus on that particular night. So I was feeling a little relieved, but also amazed and still a little eerie. And I just kind of took a moment to bask in that nighttime corvid glory for a while. And then I continued on my way. So 2 days later, same class, same time, I was excited to go back and experience the same thing and see all those crows. But for whatever reason, that night, that section of campus was completely barren, not a crow or any other bird in sight for that matter. And again, for reasons only the crows know, they decided to roost somewhere else that night. And I have other personal crow stories, but that's the one that continues to amaze me to this day. And I'd love to hear your crow stories too after the talk. So, what is a crow? A crow is a eukaryotic animal that is classified as an oscine passerine or perching songbird. In fact, they are the largest of the songbirds. We go over all those terms in previous episodes, what makes a bird, and so on. The crow is a type of corvid, and yes, that R is a very important distinction. And in the corvid family, you also have other crows, you have ravens, rooks, jackdaws, jays, magpies, my favorite, which is treepies, chuffs, and nutcrackers. And I would guess that Mitch Oss probably has almost all of these in his photo collection from his travels around the world. But there are over 120 described species of corvids worldwide, and they're among the most intelligent birds in the world. And actually, they're among the most intelligent animals in the world, as we'll soon see. There are 45 species of crows, ravens, and rooks that belong to the genus Corvus, which is both Greek and Latin for raven. And there's no biological distinction between the birds that are called crows and the ones that are called ravens, but we tend to give the name raven to the bigger birds in this genus. So the Latin name for the American crow is Corvus brachyrhynchus. Brachyrhynchus means short bill, a reference to the shorter bill of the crow compared to the common raven, with which it shares much of its range. It's called the American crow because it's native to the Americas, which, quick aside, I recently learned that America may not be named for the explorer Amerigo Vespucci, as we've all been taught. Some argue that when naming lands for people, you would use the last name, so it would have been some form of Vespucci land. And there are credible arguments that the continents were instead given the name America because that was the native term for a mountain range in Nicaragua that would have been one of the earliest landing spots of Western explorers. But that's for a future discussion. The word crow is onomatopoeic, one of my favorite words. It sounds like its call, much like the chickadee-dee-dee-dee and the bee-wee. We have the American cow. Okay, so about that intelligence. Many of us have heard the term bird brain in reference to something or someone that's not very intelligent, and it's a terrible term, and we've been wrong for so long, and we really owe them an apology because evidence supports that crows and some other birds are among the most intelligent animals in the world. One measure of intelligence is called the encephalization quotient, which is the brain to body mass ratio. So if you look at this chart, you see that heavy animals are on the right and lighter animals are on the left. And the key is whether the animal is above or below that line. And then more importantly, how far they are above or below the line, which is that measure of brain to body mass ratio. And this chart shows that crows are comparable to the apes and the dolphins in this measure. According to McGowan, crows are smarter than many undergraduates, but probably not as smart as ravens. So we'll put them right in between. And he, of course, is referring to the American crow in this case, because the New Caledonian crow may hold the crown for the smartest bird. Actually, there's the New Caledonian crow It may be rivaled only by some parrots, and according to some recent studies, a crow native to Hawaii, the critically endangered alala. But the 1/4 ounce brain in the New Caledonian crow accounts for 2.7% of the bird's overall weight, which may not seem like much until you realize the 3-pound brain in the average human accounts for just 1.9% of their overall weight. In test after test, some birds perform as well as the great apes in things like problem solving, awareness, and consciousness, cognitive abilities, which is quite amazing, especially considering that their brain is totally smooth and lacks the ridges that we have that gives that extra surface area ratio. But what they lack in the surface area, they make up for in other areas such as neuron density, and they have a higher neuron density than the great apes and the mammals in their forebrain, which again relates to intelligence and cognitive reason. In fact, for a long time, humans were thought to be unique in their ability to be aware of the self and to both make and use tools. But in the past few decades, research has shown that that's not the case. Crows, cetaceans, the dolphins, the porpoises, and apes all show a high degree of self-awareness. And one of the main ways that scientists test for this is using mirrors and then altering some part of an animal to see if they notice the change in the mirror, which would then, take that step to that they're seeing themselves and not another animal. So if we were to dye your hair purple tonight while you were sleeping and you wake up tomorrow, you might notice in the mirror the next day that there's something different and you try to do something about it or not. In the case of crows, they put brightly colored marks under their bill and their throats so that they wouldn't be able to see it unless they looked in a mirror. And then after the crows looked at themselves in the mirror, they did attempt to remove the mark that they could have only seen in the mirror. And so there's that degree of self-recognition that they know that it's them. So that, again, supports a high degree of cognition, which is compared to that cardinal that lives in your neighborhood. You know the one I'm talking about. He's the one that looks in the car mirror and sees not himself, but his competitor, and he tries to fight with it for days. The poor guy. There's no recognition of self there. Another trait that we thought was uniquely human for a long time was the ability to both make and use tools. And there are actually quite a few animals that use tools, from fish to octopuses, elephants to dolphins, but there's fewer animals that will both craft a tool and then use it, which is most often exhibited by the great apes and the birds. A quick Google search of crows and tools will take you to some really fun clickbait where crows, both in the wild and in the lab, will perform experiments. They'll use a stick to try to get a grub out of a log. And if it doesn't work, they'll modify it. They'll fashion a hook on the end or make it shorter or look for a more firm stick or a longer stick. Crows also show amazing problem-solving skills, using water displacement to get to a treat, for example. In fact, one of Aesop's fabled tales tells the story of a crow that can't reach the water in a pitcher, but they're thirsty. But they realize that if they drop enough pebbles in the bottom of the container, the water level will rise and they can take a drink. And that is indeed a problem-solving skill that crows in the labs have demonstrated very well. Only usually in those cases, there's usually a tasty treat floating on top of the water that they can't reach unless they raise the water level by dropping in an object. And they quickly learn not only to do that, but which objects are good at that. So a floating object is going to be useless. So they learn to avoid those. And then they figure out which objects are best for water displacement. Another seemingly simple skill that's actually complex is when crows coordinate their feet and their bill to gather up string to raise something up that's at the bottom, a prize that's dangling beneath it that has to be untied that they can't fly to. So even that simple coordination is a complex skill. And so we'll take our first video break to watch an example of this amazing problem-solving skills of crows. And it's really important to know that the birds in these experiments are taken from the wild for only a few weeks. So these aren't birds that have been in a lab and can learn this stuff for a long time. They've only been there for a few weeks. and then they're released back into the wild. So you'll see that, you know, it's pretty, these things are pretty novel to the bird themselves, the birds themselves. So I'll take a quick. All right, you may have to adjust the volume, but here's our first video for today.
The meat is positioned so deep in the narrow box, it's out of reach of the crow's beak. But Alex has positioned a number of other objects nearby. The question is, can 007 use the tools available to solve the puzzle?
Imagine that you're a crow. Here's your food in a deep hole. How would you go about, with the tools available to you on this table, solving this problem?
The bird's toolkit includes a short stick hanging on a piece of string, 3 stones inside wooden cages, and a longer stick trapped in a plastic box. First, the crow must use the short stick to get the stones, and then use all 3 stones to get the long stick.
And now the crows can take this and probe it into the hole and roll, much better than I can, the food out of the hole and get themselves a nice, tasty reward.
It's a complicated task. The crow is familiar with the individual pieces of the puzzle. He's done each of them separately for a food reward. But this is the first time he's seen them arranged like this. 8 separate stages that must be completed in a particular order if the puzzle is to be solved. If the bird succeeds, it'll be a world first. He takes time to have a look. And then starts with the short stick. He finds it too short to reach the food. He then sets off to get the first stone. Got it. But he doesn't seem to know what to do with it. And another. He appears to be stuck. But now something seems to click. He dispatches the first stone. Then returns to collect the last one. Got it. The final stage. Success. 8 individual stages complete. The crow performed all 8 tasks in the correct order.
All right. I love the way documentaries use music to help tell the story and to help, like, I don't know, tell wonder and stress and some other things. But again, you know, it's just amazing to me that that was, you know, wild bird up until a few weeks before. And, you know, 007 needed to intuit, to use insight to solve the problem, to understand the steps necessary to reach a future positive scenario, and in this case, getting the treat. So self-awareness and tool use are two of the biggies related to crow intelligence. And with those as a base, from here, it only gets more fun, particularly as we get into the research of John Marsloff of the University of Washington, who's kind of a rock star, and he has an excellent TED Talk on bird intelligence. I encourage you to watch it. If we go back to the bird brain, there are several key features that we share with birds. We have a hippocampus that's important in our spatial and experiential memories. And there's so much evidence that birds are excellent in terms of spatial recognition and memories together. And they also have an amygdala, which we also have, and that handles emotions and feelings. And those two areas communicate quite a bit with each other. So crows associate feelings with memories. And a third very important feature of bird and human brains is the ability to reconsider information. Most animal brains, and sometimes ours, and sometimes birds, will take in information, and then you have an immediate reaction. But sometimes birds and humans and a few other animals will take in information, and then there may be a reaction that you want to do something, but you don't do it. You don't act upon it. You reconsider it. You ponder it. You send that information back and forth between the forebrain and the thalamus. You combine that information with your memories and your feelings, and you start to consider alternate reactions. We and they do this even while we're sleeping and dreaming. So birds dream too. And I can think of many times when I wake up and I just finished with a dream, and I'm just sitting in bed thinking about it, and I've got this new perspective and a new idea or a new action I might want to do that morning that I didn't consider the night before, which is why we have that phrase, let's sleep on it, when we're pondering a complex problem. And there's strong evidence that crows are doing this too. They're using that sensory input, combining it with memories and feelings, and then they reconsider, how did they feel when a particular event took place at a particular location. And maybe they'll consider altering their behavior either that day, or if the event occurs again, they won't do the same thing. So with all this in mind, Marsloff's groundbreaking research took place. And we know already that crows can recognize self. We know that most animals can recognize other individuals of their own species. But what about recognition of individuals from a different species? There are many cases where this occurs. It's not uncommon. Particularly after you have cross-species interactions, whether it's you and your dog, or there's so many examples of that. But then the question becomes, how do they recognize individuals from different species? Is it smell? Is it optics? Is it behavior? Marsloff tells a fun story of a couple living in Sweden that had some magpies in their backyard. And the woman started to feed the magpies, and they got used to it. And eventually they learned that when she came outside, they would approach her for food, and she would indulge them. And then that led to them pecking at her window to elicit her feeding behavior. And then finally it reached the point where they learned to ring her doorbell to get her to come outside to feed them. So the birds and the woman, they were conditioning each other. But as it turns out, the birds did not like her husband, likely because when he left the house, he would shoo them away. And the birds somehow recognized that among their two cars, he would sit in the driver's side of his car and the passenger side of her car. And so the birds would only take a crap on the windows of the side of the car where the husband sat. So they're combining that individual human recognition with spatial and emotional thoughts, in this case, kind of a revenge. And she elicited a very different reaction from the magpies than he did. And once again, because Tori may be listening, I do have to bring in some element of poop to the story. So Marsloff took this apparent ability of crows to recognize humans to the University of Washington in what would soon become really groundbreaking research. And this is one of my favorite short videos, so we'll watch it together.
Crows have this amazing ability to recognize individual humans, but how do they do it? Can they distinguish body shapes or our hair or smell? Maybe it's our face. Professor John Marsloff of the University of Washington asked his students to put on a caveman mask, one of those cheap Halloween masks, when they caught and tagged wild crows. That way the crows would see, fear, and maybe remember the particular caveman face. Then Professor Marsloff asked all kinds of different people to walk across campus wearing the same caveman mask. But these people had never, ever tagged a crow. And yet, whenever crows saw that mask, whether it was on a skinny young man or a big older man or a woman, skin color didn't matter, size didn't matter. Every time they saw that mask, crows let loose a series of angry caws, as in, watch out, that guy is a bad guy. But just in case it was something about the mask, its smell, its shininess, whatever, Professor Marsloff purchased a Vice President Dick Cheney mask. He gave that mask to volunteers to walk across the campus looking like Dick Cheney, and the crows, who had nothing against Dick Cheney, they just sat silently. But perhaps the most startling evidence that faces do matter came when Professor Marsloff asked his volunteers to rotate the caveman mask and walk through campus with that face turned upside down. Marsloff reports that some crows, as they flew by, actually turned upside down mid-flight to get a better look at the caveman. Very strong evidence that crows distinguish humans by faces. Which leaves the final question, why? Why can crows recognize our faces when we can't recognize theirs? Well, maybe it's because for tens of thousands of years, crows have needed to tell us apart. One person might feed them, another person might shoot them, Professor Marsloff says, so it pays for a crow to pay attention. While we people, we aren't threatened or helped by individual crows, so they need to know about us, but we don't need to know about them individually. And that's what I call the crow paradox.
And one of the craziest things about this study is that even after 8 years after this initial study, this local population of crows still reacts only to the caveman mask. So the offspring of these birds, the ones that had the negative experiences of being caught, they still react to that mask even though they were never personally affected by it. They just knew that that mask was bad. And so crows were able to teach their friends and relatives and future generations that the caveman mask was bad based on experiences that had happened a long time ago. So this is evidence of cultural learning, which is another layer of crow intelligence, that ability to pass along indirect experiential references to each other, both in the moment and into the future. Research has also supported the idea of emotional intelligence in crows, which again makes sense given that they have an amygdala. And it takes the form of things like compassion and behaviors that are best explained as having fun or seeking thrills, and then wanting to recreate those experiences. There's evidence that the crows, that when they're solving those complex problems in the lab, like 007, that they're actually experiencing pleasurable stimuli. It's not just that end reward, but it's the process that is pleasurable, likely in the same way that we enjoy both doing and finishing a good crossword puzzle or an escape room. So one of my favorite YouTube videos shows a crow sledding down a snow-covered roof on a lid that acts like a sled, and it continually brings the lid to the top of the roof and then rides down the sledding hill again. Similarly, some crows will seek what we think is pleasure, taking pieces of bark up into the strong wind and then riding them like surfboards on the air currents. And there is an evolutionary explanation for this behavior through that kind of risk and reward that allows for novel behaviors to develop, which can then again be passed culturally and socially to a population. But you got to think that this is just a fun thing for them to do. According to Marsloff, there are 3 very important factors that are shared by the animals to which we attribute higher intelligence. So first is that large and complex brain that we've already discussed. Second is that these animals tend to be longer lived. so they have more time to learn based on their own experiences and the experiences of others, including previous generations. And the final factor has to do with their sociality, which is explained as the social intelligence hypothesis, that theorizes that being social drives cognitive advances, which then leads to more brain power. And then brains take a huge amount of energy from your body. So in some cases, it makes individuals more vulnerable. And then we require social groups for both the protection and the learning and innovations that spread through populations through communication and observations. And there's another somewhat unique and peculiar behavior that seems to be shared by these groups of animals, which is recognizing and reacting in particular ways when one of their own dies, what can be explained as mourning behavior or funeral-like behavior, that often has at least the appearance of an element of compassion. And this is where the work of corvid thanatologists, so there's a whole field out there called comparative thanatology that looks at research that researches animal funerals. And that's where Dr. Kaylee Swift's research comes in. And she's a student of Dr. Marzloff, and she's become an expert in crow mourning behavior. And according to Swift, a typical reaction of a crow that comes across another adult deceased crow is that they first will give a unique alarm call that calls in neighboring crows, almost exactly as if they were calling in other birds to mob a predator like an owl or a hawk. So the crows gather around this deceased body for a period of time. It can be as short as 15 minutes, or it can be as long as 40 hours or more. And they're calling out. They're basically, creating noise and communicating. And it's not clear what determines how long that group of crows will stick around, whether they know the other crow or not. But adult crows just don't tend to die. So, they're picked off by predators often. And it will also then cause some additional behaviors that are a little harder to explain. So in some cases, individual birds will bring an object to the body of the deceased. Often it's something like a stick or a feather. In one case, a crow bought a candy wrapper and placed it near the deceased's body. Sometimes crows will gently touch the body. Sometimes they'll aggressively attack it or attack other birds that are attending the funeral. And sometimes crows will exhibit very strange behaviors around the deceased, as if they are really not sure what to do in what would be a case of displacement behavior. So for example, if two gulls are in conflict, instead of fighting or fleeing, sometimes they'll do something totally out of context, like aggressively pulling grass out of the ground, which really doesn't seem to make sense. But it's like the birds are thinking, oh, I need to do something. This other bird is threatening me, but I don't like my options, so I'm just going to mow the lawn. Or it's like when I have a big project coming up for work, so I decide to sort the cassette tapes in my attic. And it appears as if crows at a funeral are so pumped up with some sort of feeling that they really don't know what to do with either. And some argue that they can be gathering information like, hey, maybe there's some information here that can help me not die, like this crow that just died. And they do tend to be wary when returning to that site in the future. But regardless, crows that come across a dead crow exhibit a strong response. And it's evident even when you study the brain activities of crows that are presented with a carcass. And of course, because Dr. Swift is a student of Dr. Marzloff, she naturally brought the human masks into the equation. And we'll see this in our final video break for today, which is one of my favorites.
Big news! You can now support Deep Look on Patreon. More after the show. A verdant park. An idyllic day. But something has gone terribly wrong. A passerby discovers it first and lets out a piercing call. Within seconds, everyone in earshot rushes to the scene. It's mayhem, or so it seems. Crows are intelligent and super chatty. They watch out for one another within tight-knit groups. As adults, it's pretty rare for crows to be killed. So when one dies, the others notice. Are they just scared, or is something deeper going on? Kaylee Swift, a PhD candidate at the University of Washington, set up an experiment to find out. She visits a park in Seattle for a few days, leaving piles of peanuts for the crows. Then one day, Swift shows up looking very different. Wearing a mask and wig, she carries a dead, taxidermied crow. The first one that sees her sounds the alarm. The flock erupts in protest. The crows seem to wail and scold her and the dead bird. Swift calls these crow funerals, though they're not the solemn memorials we put on for our dead. She thinks these noisy gatherings are opportunities for crows to learn about the dangers that surround them within the safety of the group. When an unmasked Swift returns to the park the next week with more tasty peanuts, the crows are quiet and wary. They seem to have learned there's something hazardous about this place. Still, they eat the peanuts, but they take longer to approach and seem to be much more suspicious. And when Swift returns wearing the mask, they lose it. Even without the dead crow, they still see her as a threat. Compare that to these pigeons. They barely seem to register her holding their deceased comrade. That's how most creatures react. Just a few, like dolphins, elephants, and crows, react strongly to seeing one of their own who's died. Even weeks later, the crows cause a ruckus when they see the mask. Some never even saw her with the dead crow, but they still learn to associate her with danger. It's called social learning, gaining new information by observing and imitating others. We're always looking to learn from one another too, to avoid the mistakes that led others to meet their untimely end. Hey there, we love making Deep Look, and if you love it too.
So I'm not gonna lie, that mask totally creeped me out too. Way more so than the caveman mask or even the Dick Cheney mask.
Hey Tim, can you move your microphone down?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so that was super creepy. But what a fun thesis, to study, and so interesting. And there are a few more really cool things to mention about crows and crow intelligence. Well, there are a lot more actually, and there's a million more videos I could have picked, but I'll end today's talk with just a few kind of rapid fire quick facts. First, crows have a rudimentary quantitative awareness and have a basic counting ability. Second, they have what is known as a theory of mind, meaning a crow is aware that I am me, you are you, and you may have a different motive than me. They're also perceptive and will change their behaviors based on what they perceive in the environment. One of the coolest examples of this also comes from Dr. Swift's research. She was studying a pair of crows and looking for the site that they were building their nest. After a few days, she found that they were bringing sticks to a particular tree, and so she thought she knew where the nest was going to be. It wasn't until later that she realized that they would only bring sticks to that tree when they knew she was watching them. So that nest was an intended distraction to get her attention away from the real nest. And other birds will build decoy nests, but this is a case where crows were building a decoy nest as a result of a particular human that they knew was watching them. Another fun crow fact, even though we probably don't hear much variation in their voices, a cause, a cause, a caw to us, they pack a lot of language and context into their vocalizations, and they speak in regional dialects. And if a crow from one area joins a social group in another area, they have to learn that new dialect, mainly by mimicking the dominant members of the new group. And they're excellent mimics. Another great way to spend your time is to search for talking crows and ravens on YouTube. It's really remarkable, not only how well they can mimic human voices and words, but how much their voices sounds like the humans that they learn from, that they're mimicking. And some great stories, again, on Marslift's TED Talks, not only about birds that do an excellent job mimicking humans, but then they learn how to use those words in context. Really incredible. Sometimes crows will enlist their own young from previous broods to stick around as babysitters to help defend the nest, feed mom and dad, or feed the young at the nest. And this can happen for up to several years after the older sisters and brothers are born. Crows can express a high degree of self-control and delayed gratification, much like that famous study with humans, where you give a child the option of eating one cookie now or waiting 5 minutes for 2 cookies. Crows in control studies will pass on a common food item that they like if they know that doing so will give them a much preferred food item if they wait a few minutes. And then what's the deal with the group of crows being called a murder? It turns out that a murder of crows is entirely colloquial and cultural, just like a parliament of owls and an unkindness of ravens. And it likely got its roots in the Crusades, when scores of bodies would litter a battlefield, and crows, being the opportunists they are, would come to feed on the bodies. And then there's kind of a gross thing that you might see or have heard about in crows, that they peck eyes first. But mammal skin is tough and eyes are softer, so it makes sense that they might go for the softer parts first. But because of many of these stories and the unfortunate resemblance to crows that the doctors would wear during the plague to protect themselves from the unpleasant odor of pestilence, crows and ravens are often associated with death, particularly in the West. But in the East, in places like Japan, crows are associated with wisdom. And as I mentioned in the opening, people around the world do seem to have a spiritual connection to the birds. And I didn't even have time to talk about the Japanese crows that learn to crack very hard nutshells by dropping them in the roads, flying over to the curb, and then waiting until the pedestrian crosswalk turned green to retrieve the crushed nut pieces with the pedestrians, removing the danger of being run over by cars. So many stories yet to learn about crows. And I don't know about you, but the next time I see a crow in a tree, in addition to asking myself, does that tree sense my presence? I might ask myself, does that crow know who I am? So thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll end with the wise words of Mary Oliver. Crows, from a single grain they have multiplied. When you look in the eyes of one, you have seen them all. At the edges of highways, they pick at limp things. They are anything but refined, or they fly out over the corn like pellets of black fire, like overlords. Crow is crow, you say. What else is there to say? Drive down any road, take a train or an airplane across the world, leave your old life behind, die and be born again. Wherever you arrive, they will be there first, glossy and rowdy and indistinguishable, the deep muscle of the world. Thanks, everyone. I will stop sharing.